Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever you are joining us from. My name is Thomas Hale. I'm professor here in the Blavatnik School of Government, and this is our debriefing of COP29, which took place in Baku last month. The Blavatnik School had a pre-briefing before the event took place, where we looked at what was expected, and today we're going to be unpacking what happened and looking forward to the future of climate policy in a world shaped by the outcomes we've seen in Azerbaijan. I'm joined today by an all-star panel, and I'm very proud that most of them are indeed our current Master of Public Policy students here in the Blavatnik School, but even more importantly than that, they are leaders, thinkers, doers in the world of climate action who have tremendous insights to bring to bear on this question. And just to briefly introduce them, I'm joined by Vanessa Nakate, who is an environmentalist and Uganda's First Fridays for Future striker, and is a co-founder of the TARD Foundation. I'm joined by Omnia Omrani, who was the first youth envoy, official youth envoy, chosen as part of the university process as part of COP27, which took place in Egypt 2 years ago, and is an expert on health and climate change. And I'm joined by Camille Etienne, who directs a leading NGO in France that looks at sustainability questions, is one of the most prominent voices in France on the climate crisis. So Vanessa, Omnia, Camille, welcome to you. We're also expecting to be joined by my colleague and professor of practice, Rachel Kyte, who is the UK's climate envoy. She should be joining us shortly. But let's dive right in. COP29 took place in a rather, shall we say, challenging year geopolitically, and there are some somewhat challenging circumstances. And expectations were high for this event to be able to deliver both a deal on global finance, which we'll come to, but also to serve as a bridge to the next round of pledges under the Paris Agreement, which are due next year. And so expectations were very much raised going into this event. A lot of media coverage, and let's just review some of the key things that happened. And Omni, I wonder if I could start with you. So there was a big expectation on finance, and there was a deal agreed on finance. How do we interpret what was agreed in Azerbaijan 2 weeks ago?
Yeah, thank you so much, Tom. And I'm very happy to be joined by all the MPP students who I really aspire to. I think for this COP, many refer to COP29 as the finance COP. And this started because in COP21 in Paris, there was one of the last pieces in the Paris Agreement puzzle to be completed was developing a new goal on climate finance, which was initially started as delivering 100 billion US dollars every year until 2025, where this new goal is going to be created. And this was a way of for developed countries to enable developing countries to transition and to deliver on their climate commitments. And most countries, especially developing ones, had the expectation of this goal becoming at least 1.3 trillion, which is the number that is needed for all countries to be able to transition to net zero carbon and to reach the global temperature to be below 1.5 degrees. But it has been very intense throughout the 2 weeks of COP29. The final goal that was delivered had a few elements. The first element that instead of 100 billion, it's going to be 300 billion every year for developing countries by 2035. The second element, because it's did not reach that 1 trillion, there was an invitation for other sources of finance to come in to fill in this gap from the private sector and other elements to reach that 1.3 trillion that is needed. But also the last element was an invitation for not only developed countries, which is around 24 developed countries were the ones who were always supplying that finance goal, to also have developing countries to come in and contribute to the global climate finance goal that should be delivered every year. But this, however, upsetted many of the countries because of the difference in expectations of what is needed. And at the same time, there's also the injustice that many developing nations are feeling, having the least contributions to global carbon emissions, being asked to deliver on their climate commitments, but not having the necessary support and the necessary funding to be able to do that transition, and also how the negotiations were very sped up at the end and very chaotic in many contexts and many COPs that we see. And this is why there was many frustrations around this goal that was developed.
And I think it's either a sign of great achievement to come up with a goal that no one is pleased with because it means everyone had to compromise, or it's a sign of a lack of success if you come up with a goal that no one is pleased with. I'm just curious how this group would interpret the complex outcome you just described, Omnia. Is 300 billion to be delivered plus a 1.3 trillion kind of to be mobilized goal. Is that progress, or is that something that leaves so much to be desired that actually is a failure? I wonder, Vanessa, if you could come to your views on that. How do you see it?
Thank you so much, Tom. So I would love to talk about it more from the responses that came from different developing countries and how, they referred to that outcome. To some people, it was a slap in the face. To some countries, it was a joke. And to some people, it was like, COP has become a place where developed countries are literally negotiating climate finance or phasing out fossil fuels with the lives of people that are suffering right now. So from the perspective of those that are on the front lines of the climate crisis, who are scared of losing their lives, losing their livelihoods, being displaced by climate disasters, this is not progress at all, because the demand was clear. This was supposed to be a finance scope and develop, like my colleague Omnia said, they needed $1.3 trillion. 300 billion is not, like, compared to 1.3 trillion, there is a huge gap. And it kind of leaves this vague language of, we'll have the private sector come in as well to support, but who is going to hold the private sector accountable? Like, is there a framework in place that is going to hold businesses accountable to provide, a certain kind of amount when it comes to climate finance? And also in the aspect of loss and damage, we saw the loss and damage fund put into operationalization, but there was no money coming into the fund. There was a lot of disappointment for developing countries as well. So I wouldn't say that this is progress. I would say that this was a slap in the face for those that have to face the impacts of the climate crisis right now.
Thank you, Vanessa. I think one of the other ideas thrown into the mix, which wasn't part of the agreed outcome, but was very much in the air, was thinking about how to mobilize new sources of finance. For example, interesting proposals coming from France and Kenya and others on new forms of international taxation as a way to begin to find more reliable, predictable sources of revenue, even if the numbers are small at this stage. But it speaks to the point of, is there a new system that's needed to address the funding gaps that we see? I wonder if you would have an additional thought on the finance question before we shift to other elements of the Baku outcome.
Yeah, I guess as Vanessa said and Alight, I guess the main issue is, how do we collectively feel after that kind of international negotiation? I guess the main word will be disappointment. And coming from a past where the promises have been made, like I come from a country where the Paris Agreement was born. I saw my prime minister crying on the screen TV when I was just starting activism. So I remember the hope that can go out of these international rooms. But the thing is, with this finance aspect of the COP, what we've been going through this past years is that even with the very low promise, the promise was like 100 billion, there was like not even delivered. So the money was agreed on, but it was not on the table. So the call from all the map at the most affected place and area was saying, like, at least you should deliver the money that you promised. So I guess on the finance, only to stay on the finance aspect, there is obviously a revision that must be done on the way we draft COP. What are we waiting for this? Is it a negotiation room, or do we have more binding things at the end? And also on the new way, where could we actually find the money? One suggestion is that as you may know, there's a lot of lobbyists, like fossil fuel lobbyists, that are invited in the negotiation room. This year, it was like 2 times more than the COP in 2022. We had like more than 180 people from, like, 1,080 people from the lobby sector. So we kind of said, okay, if they are invited in a negotiation, so that means that their voice count, maybe their money could count as well. So maybe an idea would be like to actually implement a tax on the fossil fuel industry that will be directly redirect to most affected place and area. And talking about that, there is this ongoing topic that I invite you to have a deeper look on, which is the East African crude oil pipeline that we both worked a lot on together with Vanessa. There is some kind of project that could be agreed only if the money actually goes to finance the loss and damages fund.
Yeah, really interesting insights into that aspect of it. I guess the point you're raising on the broader fit for purposeness of the COP, let's come back to that, because I think that's one of the questions we'd like to come to. But before we get there, there are also some interesting agreements reached in Baku on so-called Article 6. This is a system through which credits or different kinds of exchanges of emissions reductions might be exchanged between countries, but also some things that weren't agreed, or at least were postponed into future COPs. For example, the follow-up to the so-called global stocktake, the process under the Paris Agreement, which took place at COP28 last year, which included a sort of so-called UAE consensus, which has a commitment to transition away from fossil fuels, also to triple renewable energy and to double energy efficiency. And that sort of quite concrete, immediate action point wasn't picked up on by countries this year. It was postponed, an outcome that was postponed until the next COP. Vanessa, I wonder if I could come to you. This was very much on people's minds. Azerbaijan is a significant oil and gas producer. There was questions about whether the ambition would be there to maintain the agreement that was reached last year. How do you interpret that result, or what can we understand about the dynamics around that?
Yes, I'll follow from something that Camille said, that these decisions are made, but then they are not implemented. So you find that one of the things in the consensus is the transitioning away from fossil fuels. However, we still see that countries are still considering to open new fossil fuel, infrastructure. And I think that the postponing of the conversation around fossil fuels, it's really running away from the elephant in the room. And I think we've seen it with different climate conferences. It's so easy to talk about climate adaptation, but when it comes to fossil fuels, it feels like that is something that no one wants to talk about, because countries are really not ready to make that transition. So we've kind of found ourselves in a situation where we are celebrating all these agreements, these outcomes that are suggested, but then when you follow up, there is really no action. Countries continue to fall back on their action. Right now, countries will say, in the UAE consensus, we say we're going to triple our renewable energy, we're going to transition away from fossil fuels, we're going to ensure that net zero emissions are achieved by 2050. However, they still allow for room for fossil fuel development. And I think that is what is, opening up conversations on issues around carbon capture storage, because I think this is still language that is being highly proposed by the fossil fuel industry. And even when you talk about carbon footprint, it was highly pushed to the public by the fossil fuel industry. So it's more like the fossil fuel industry is doing all it can to stay in business, and they are really not ready to make that transition. So that's why we always see like these issues being postponed. Like Camille said, there were over 1,700 fossil fuel lobbyists at the COP. Last year, there were, I think, about 2,000 fossil fuel lobbyists at the COP. And it's really hard to see decisions that ensure protection of the planet when the very industries that are fueling the climate crisis are in the, in the same space. I've been in some of the rooms where you find that there are deals that are happening at the climate conference. So if we still have, these loopholes of climate conferences becoming places where fossil fuel deals are happening, I think there was actually a video of someone from the COP presidency of this year who was negotiating fossil fuel deals. So it's really going to be hard to address the elephant in the room if the elephant is a part of, the conversations. I remember someone saying that if you want to discuss malaria, you do not bring mosquitoes into the room, because the mosquitoes will not be excited about the eradication of malaria, because probably that is how they thrive. So it's really hard to have the fossil fuel industry having delegations bigger than countries in these spaces and expect to really have concrete decisions. So we are constantly seeing some of these discussions being postponed.
Thank you. And I think one of the interesting questions there is how this gets taken forward in COP30 next year in Brazil. Brazil obviously has great responsibility in hosting this key COP, where the COP by which country will come to this, but countries will definitely have to have had their new pledges under the Paris Agreement by then. Brazil is one of the few countries that have already put forward its third NDC, which includes an interesting line. It says, even though Brazil is expanding oil and gas production, to your point, Vanessa, about perhaps some hypocrisy, it says it would be wanting to transition away from them following an orderly, internationally agreed process. And so for the COP to sort of just not even be able to come to an agreement on that does make it really hard to see how we make progress on that. Omnia, would you like to add anything on this point of fossil fuels?
Yeah, I agree with Vanessa, and I think there was among all, particularly civil society organizations in many countries during COP28, the sentiment of, yes, we have fossil fuel for the first time in the text, and yet we have it in a very vague language, and this is going to create a lot of issues in the upcoming COP, in the sense of how our country is going to interpret that. Where is it going to go? And this is exactly what happened in COP29, because there was the expectation of fossil fuel has now been mentioned in the COP. When we talk about and negotiate mitigation and just transition, which now has its own program, it is a given that fossil fuels will be discussed, and a pathway to transition away from fossil fuel will be discussed. But then countries right at the beginning of COP29 were divided and polarized by two different stances. A set of countries, for them, mentioning fossil fuel in the mitigation program was a red line, and other countries, including the mention of fossil fuel, is essential. And this is why the mitigation negotiations over the 2 weeks reached a deadlock. And at the end, they had a text. The only substantial thing about this text was we are going to negotiate further in COP30. There was no mention of fossil fuel where it belonged. And the second thing, there was no mandate of how this mention of fossil fuel is going to inform the next set of NDCs. And only the mitigation program touched upon considering the nature of countries designing their own national climate plans and giving them that flexibility of doing what they want, which still lacks a big question around where is the accountability with all these decisions and texts that are being adopted. And I think, as Vanessa said, not only fossil fuel lobbyists, it's also many countries come with their ministers of oil and petroleum into the negotiations. So it is not just the private sector coming in, it's also inherently the governments themselves and the kind of influence and the kind of delegations and negotiators they have inside these rooms. And this is why one of the good outcomes, I think, from Baku was there was another set of negotiations that looked into something called response measures, which is a program that is designed to understand what are the carbon cutting policies that countries are developing, what is the impact of these policies on countries, which kind of creates a space for also conversations around trade, which also is another achievement related to the carbon markets and the development of this program after so many years of it being negotiated. But what's really good about having response measures was it's also did not just tackle mitigation, also tackle just transition, which is another terminology that is being pushed a lot by developing countries, and it also made it during the Baku negotiations. So it was one of the small wins. I think another win to look beyond the negotiations a little bit is how the presidency itself designs its own initiatives, which also helps mobilize countries to have some commitments outside of the negotiations. For example, in my space in health, a coalition was developed across COP27 in Egypt, COP28, COP29, and COP30, where ministers of health are going to come every COP to make the case for health, to make the case for climate action, and how to not only engage the health sector, but also how to engage the health evidence that is needed to move these negotiations as urgently as possible. And this coalition has just started in Baku and will be developed for many years to come as a constant mandate for both ministers of environment, but also ministers of health to come, to show up, to move more the negotiations towards the needs and the health of the communities in the developing countries.
I think it's a really interesting point to note how different issue areas like health, like trade, are now becoming much more closely connected into the COP process, for better or worse. And I wonder if it'd be a good chance to revise this point you were making before, Camille, about is the COP fit for purpose? Can it deliver what it needs to do? There was a letter that a number of former CCC leaders and COP kind of grandees signed during the week saying, actually, we would like to see the COP become much more implementation focused. But as Omnia is saying, there have been innovations. There have been, for example, a greater role of some of the non-state actors. There's been new issues like health that have been embraced more carefully. So we do see some kind of innovation as well. But from your perspective, what would the COP really need to do to be, what could it do to become more effective?
Should I answer?
Please.
I mean, it's a whole it's deep question, the $1 million question. I guess, like, for now, the question was, to be super honest, I wasn't very aligned with my government choice. And most of the European, also US leaders that decided not to come, they just leave the chair empty because they were like saying like, oh, we don't want to have dirty hand. But this is like negotiation is all about that. And this was our final lecture today in Foundation was technically on that. How do we get our hands dirty in politics sometimes and still try to be ethical? So I guess it's at the core of this, like, if we still want to have this kind of framework where we try to work together, how do we keep this? So I feel, so for me, it was very lazy from them not to come to the COP and then says, well, at the end of the day, it wasn't like such a good COP because they were not there. And they were supposed to be the one that actually faced this double injustice, which is the fact that the most affected people and places are the one that has been participating the less over the past decades on the massive challenge we're facing now. So first thing, I would say, I would make it like mandatory, or at least I would make sure that every single policymaker actually come and commit at the end. That's the first thing. We need to go. It's as simple as that. We first need to go. So no more boycott, even with places we disagree on. And it's kind of a good thing, in my opinion, that this COP happen in countries that are relying a lot on fossil fuels because they are part of the problem. So we need to address the problem without feeling fears and being shaking. But mostly the issue for me is like, I would make a COP without lobbyists on it. It must be forbidden to have fossil fuel lobbyists on it. Honestly, this is something that we can't afford. So that's the first thing I would argue. So no more lobbyists in the blue zone, no more lobbyists in the green zone. We don't need them in the room. That looks simple, but that's honestly the key. Then maybe something, I feel, to be very honest, as you said earlier, the implementation depends very much on the legislation, cultural background of each country. That's for sure. This is not what we attend from negotiation, international negotiation. Yet, something that could be concrete is having the treaty as the one that we had on nuclear, the non-proliferation treaty on nuclear weapon, the one that we are about to win in into this like deep sea mining issues, saying like we stop, we don't move, we put a moratorium, or eventually we phase out. So I guess we would be happy with the COP once they would agreed on a phase out plan that is concrete. And then the path of doing so depend on each context, but like it won't be taken seriously until we are going through this. One single thing I want to add is like a book made by the French or some others called Jean-Baptiste Fresso's. It's called Sans Transition. The translation would be Without Transitioning. And it's literally on that. And it just proves through history and data, how can we see that through history, the different kind of energy just added up. So there hasn't been properly a transition. So we should start by this, saying like, if we add new energy, they just sum up with one another. So we won't be taking seriously this massive challenge humanity is facing unless we actually phase out. So to be super clear, for me, the COP will be effective when they would focus on this phase out first.
And that is exactly the debate and the balance that we're now hanging in. I want to make sure we have some time for questions. So let me just conclude by asking all three of you a kind of final look ahead question. We're now coming to the end of 2024. In 2025, we'll have COP30 in Belém in Brazil. And this is a big moment to see where countries go in terms of ratcheting up their ambition. We already mentioned a few have, but many more are expected to do so. We also, of course, have a new administration taking power in Washington, D.C., which has said it will remove the United States from the Paris Agreement. And we have, of course, looking at the bigger picture, at the end of this year, a plastics treaty negotiation that just resulted in no treaty last week. We have, a bit earlier this year, a biodiversity COP that also couldn't agree a deal on finance. So what does the bigger picture look like for this critical year coming up? I don't know if we have a look ahead. And what are you expecting in 2025? I wonder if I could start with you, Omnia, then Vanessa, and then Camille again.
Yeah, I think it's a very challenging question, and I always like your positive outlook, Tom, and I try to follow it because something that you have also mentioned in the sense of with the U.S. elections, it does not mean that so much of the progress that many states within the U.S. have made is going to be backtracked. And similarly, in many countries that have committed, and I think it's what I hope to see with the Brazil leadership is Brazil has been since the last COP calling for first the centering and the integration of the voices of indigenous communities and their knowledge and their rights and their participation, which I hope in this COP will be very central for the first time and done in a meaningful way since we are being hosted in Belém. The second important thing is also, yes, we have now a 300 billion fund that should be committed. How is it going to be delivered? And who gets access to that? And how can we also not only mobilize this amount, but also look into how this is going to be deployed? How is it going to be flexible, accessible? If we are inviting the private sector to come in, how are we going to hold them accountable, but more so incentivize them to do that in a way that is not based on loans or in a way that makes it more difficult for countries to access that funding. And also what is the opportunity of engaging beyond COP and engaging all the different stakeholders. Also being a bit biased of my former position, it has been inspiring to see more young people participating in the COP, not just as civil society, which is so critical to bringing that urgency and putting the pressure on countries to deliver, but also as negotiators on behalf of their countries. And over the last, in comparison, a study that showed from COP27 to COP28, youth participation has increased by over 100%. And having more young people negotiating on behalf of their countries and their delegations is what also gives me a lot of hope, because then they are now working with their countries to design better NDCs that are, or national climate plans that are ambitious, that center the needs of communities, but also that are innovative beyond the traditional instruments that we are seeing, and also translating that into the negotiating rooms. Even in Egypt, this year we had the second cohort of young Egyptian negotiators in Baku, and this program has been established by a youth climate council that is hosted by the Ministry of Youth in Egypt, as well as the Ministry of Foreign UN affairs, and many of these models are being established around the world.
Yeah, it's very interesting trying to see. And also we've had one of the silver linings of multilateral cooperation this year, and a difficult year for multilateral cooperation, has been the adoption of a declaration on future generations, which the UN did in September. So maybe some interesting longer term trends we can point to. Vanessa, what are you looking for in 2025?
Thank you. I would say as well that it's really a challenging question as well, because I think every year we are like either after COP or beginning of a new year, we are always told this COP is going to be a big moment. This COP is going to be a big moment. I feel like I've had it for a very long time, and I have a feeling COP31 will still say it's going to be a big moment. I just feel like it's it makes us feel like we have a lot of time, to address these challenges, because we can always postpone, we can always wait for the next COP. But for so many people, they really don't have that extra time. Like a delay is a family losing their home, a delay is someone losing their life. I think just last week we saw massive rainfall in the eastern part of Uganda that led to the death of so many people, and many households destroyed and livelihoods. So those people are not waiting for COP30 or COP31. So I just find myself in that place of every end of the year or beginning of the year, like we are always asked, this is going to be a big moment. What do you expect? And I think as the years go by, it gets really hard to answer that question. However, to follow up on what Camille has talked about, no fossil fuel lobbyists and every government really being involved in the COP process. I hope that is something that I get to see at COP30. I've always seen how it's a privilege for some people to attend COP, especially for people in developing, young activists in developing countries that struggle to access resources of accreditation or funding. So you find that those who are able to attend, including myself, I've always seen it as a privilege. But now that I think about countries that, governments that choose not to go to COP, even when they have the resources, even when they know that they should be at COP, I think they also do it from a place of privilege, because they feel like they're safe. They feel like the climate crisis is not looming at their doors. So I just really hope that at COP30, we do have the countries really involved, all countries, especially the major emitters. I think there was a report that was released maybe last year talking about how, either last year or beginning of this year, talking about how I think about half of the total emissions are going to come from just 5 countries. And it's crazy to actually think about it in that way. Like, big economies that really need to be in these spaces, they don't show up, and it means that the COP process crashes. And I hope that we have these people involved. I hope that we have no fossil fuel lobbyists making deals at COP30. And I really hope that people see that there is no much time, and that governments choose, the best for the planet and also for the people. And to follow up on the discussion that we were having earlier about every government waiting to see what another government is going to do, and Tommy mentioned that if every government is waiting for, what are you going to do, so that I can also make my action, it's going to lead to a crash. So I really hope that for COP30, governments look beyond. I feel like that would be the bigger picture. They look beyond their interests and think about the interests of humanity as a whole.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's also even closer than the interest of humanity at all. What an enlightened self-interest would do if thought about investment in climate change not as a charity, but rather as a investment in your people's long-term security. You could imagine a very different mindset taking place. We are coming toward the end of time, so I want to make sure we begin to sprinkle in some questions. And I just want to put it The first one, maybe this would be good for you, Camille. We have a question here on what role NGOs can play in the COP negotiations. So you've heard a lot today about the fossil fuel lobby, but there's also, of course, lots of NGOs there. They can't vote, but they have influence. What does that look like, and how can they be most effective? You run an NGO, amongst other things, but what would you say on this?
Maybe just before final note as well, I would just add this. I feel like, as Vanessa said, like I completely agree on this. And I think we can call this COP like the last hope COP. And well, the only thing we can actually be sure of waiting for is what the COP already created. All the COP has created two things. One is like media attention. This is the only moment on the year, to be honest, unless there's like fire or flooding or whatever that is really massive. This is the only moment of the year that every single time suddenly the media attention is there. Suddenly our phone like call is getting crazy, the three of us and like many other activists or analysts or journalists or whatever. This is the moment where this massive topic that should be at the core of every single decision making we have is addresses by people. The second thing is that it creates disappointment, and then how do we build on this disappointment? As a policymaker, how do we say, fine, if I can't wait for the other to actually do the things, I will do it first. I will be the first mover. And we can see that some countries or unexpected countries or actually start moving. Like I think about China, that is really unexpected early on this, but it is kind of doing some first move or interesting first move that I would like follow closely. So this is from the part of the political leaders. Build on this appointment to be the first mover and have the reputation, gain out of it, and also the political gain out of it. Secondly, is the NGO. How do we, as civil society, organized or not, it can be grassroots organized civil society through NGOs or other or any other kind of organization. How do we say, look, this is the moment we realize that our government are failing us. So then how can we organize a counterpower that is effective enough so that we can do the things to protect ourselves from the disastrous effect on health, on poverty, on like all the side consequences of climate change and biodiversity collapse? So I guess that at least those COP are interesting for this reason. And the thing we can wait for this COP is these two massive things. So to answer quickly this question about what can NGO do, I've never been to a COP, to be super honest, because I was feeling that not being inside the negotiation room won't make me effective, because I was not from the most affected basin area. I was just from France, and I was like, there's no need for French people representation there. I would just be screaming in the street. And honestly, I said, like, this is not the place I would be effective if I would go and take a plane to go there. I was like, that doesn't make so much sense for me doing this. Yet I've been into negotiation that were actually binding at the end, like for the one on deep sea mining. And we actually stop an entire industry from starting. We're on the way of stopping this, thanks to international negotiation. So I truly believe at the end of the day that we can achieve great things, great change through this international negotiation. Yet they have to be banning at the end. They have to be a framework that we committed to follow. So I would say from NGO, what you can do is mostly representation. It's mostly connection. It's a place usually where people connect from each other, from NGOs and civil society movement from all over the place. There's media attention there that you can use. And also it's important to show up, like to be there. I'm still happy that there's this green zone where people can be. I'm still happy that this room exists. Now, next step would be NGO, or maybe mostly I would say scientist advisor, would be actually part of the negotiation. That would be something I would love to see in the next coming COP.
Fantastic. I'm just seeing the next coming COP is next year, but the webinar is rapidly reaching its final minutes. I want to make sure we get a few more burning points. And so I wonder if we could take any final reflections, Omnia, Vanessa, you'd like to add on to Camille's last intervention.
Yeah, just one thing to add. For me, it was very inspiring to see over the last 5 COPs I've been to the critical role that civil society plays. For example, the Climate Action Network and what they do in influencing the negotiations, speaking with the negotiators, and also what young organizers are able to articulate. And they also bring in the needs of the marginalized communities who don't get the opportunity to be present in these spaces. And every time when COP reduces the spots for civil society to come in, a big movement and backlash happens because these voices, our voices, need to be represented, and also it helps create that accountability for the negotiators when they go back to their countries to implement what they signed onto in these outcome decisions and the agenda points that they adopt. So that's it from my end.
Great. And Vanessa, last word from you, please.
Yeah, thank you. I also think that the COPs are really, I see them like a global theater with different kind of actors. And it's more like if you don't show up, then your interests are not on the negotiation table. And I do believe civil society has a place at climate conferences because they influence a lot of negotiations, like Omnia said, and they really bring the perspectives of people that are on the front lines of the climate crisis. However, I do think that civil society needs to also get really involved in the Bonn Climate Conference because I think a lot happens at that conference that feeds into what actually happens at the COP. And we don't see a lot of civil society presence at the Bonn. It's usually mostly the negotiators. However, this is an opportunity to actually have bilaterals with negotiators and talk to them, tell them the experiences of people and what the communities really want. When we go to COP, it's really hard to find those opportunities to talk to them. And the best way that we do that is maybe through the media attention that Camille talked about, and also maybe mobilizing on the streets. However, that has not been possible for I think the past past 3 COPs. Yeah, it has not been possible. So yeah, I do believe that civil society has a place at COP. However, we need to find a way to engage in the Bonn conference as well, because a lot of things happen there that kind of define what happens at the climate conference at the end of the year.
I think that's a really important point. And this is the June meeting of the subsidiary bodies of the COP, meaning the kind of working groups within it, which can be another forum. We've had a fantastic set of reflections today. Maybe it's one note to end on. It is, as I said at the beginning, a very tough moment for multilateralism. There's geopolitical conflict, there's war, there's a breakdown of trust between different countries. And so many people thought that in those conditions, any kind of deal, any kind of COP would be impossible to reach. And I think what we saw at COP29, but also what we've seen a few times throughout this year, I mentioned this Declaration on Future Generations and others, is actually there is a critical mass of countries that do want to see international cooperation succeed, and that actually in that want to see a world where we don't just leave climate change to be a self-help problem, but actually find ways to help each other through cooperation. And that idea, under duress as it is a powerful and vital part of any kind of effective solution. And I think if you didn't have a COP, you probably would have to invent something like it, despite all of its difficulties. So maybe the question for everyone to reflect on going forward is, how do we make it more effective? How do we update it? How do we not be captured by the inertia of the previous 29 iterations and think about how a pivot toward implementation, toward effectiveness, toward delivery can be part of this process going forward. Thank you all for joining me today. Sorry to run a bit over. Thank you, Omnia, Camille, and Vanessa for your insightful comments. And we'll see where we get to in 2025. Have a good evening, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.